Alright ladies, this Labor Day weekend screencast is going to start with the Boston Massacre. So Boston is obviously a kind of hotspot for rebel activity during the American Revolution. There's a lot of tension building between the colonists that live in Boston settlement in Massachusetts, between them and the British officers that are being sent into Massachusetts. So on March 5th of 1770, several colonists kind of gather in Boston Square, right outside Boston Custom House, and they start throwing snowballs at the British officers and taunting them and jeering them and shouting obscenities at them. And all we really know that happened next is that a British soldier's gun went off. We really don't know if this was intentional or if he just, they probably had their fingers on the trigger ready to defend themselves if necessary since they were being harassed. But one shot was fired, and then as a reaction, all sorts of shots were fired by the other British officers. It was just kind of instinct for one gunshot, and they started firing, thinking maybe they were being attacked. I'm not trying to justify this British aggression, but I think we all see in this image, it's very much painted to look like a direct, brutal attack, planned out and intentional from the British officers, and that's just not the case. Several colonists were killed, including one man by the name of Crispus Attucks. I have his name spelled out on the screen if you need. He is considered kind of the first man to be killed, the first victim of the American Revolution, even though the official revolution by legal standards hasn't begun yet. But Paul Revere and Samuel Adams actually joined together to create this picture, and they're the ones that labeled it, as you see in the Boston newspapers, the Bloody Massacre. So they're the ones that referred to it as a massacre. And yes, England, probably shouldn't have responded that way, and I'm not justifying them. But again, it really wasn't as intentional as the picture makes it sound. So that's why this is kind of considered propaganda. Here are some images from the site of the Boston Massacre in front of the old customs house, and I have a better picture of the placard where the actual confrontation took place. And you can see it in Boston, and then also you can see in the top right corner that red brick, that's actually the Freedom Trail I was talking about in class. And here's the gravesite of the 5 people killed in the Boston Massacre. Okay, so the Tea Act and what results with it are kind of also misconstrued in history. So I told you that it would be a little confusing in class. Please be sure to pay attention so you're not confused about anything. So there was a merchant company in England called the British East India Company, and they are in a lot of financial trouble. They need help. Again, they're a British merchant company, the British East India Company. And so they appeal to Parliament to please, give them some assistance here. And so what Parliament's going to do to help them out, and since they're in danger of failing, is they're going to pass what's called the Tea Act. Now, the Tea Act was designed to basically give this company, the British East India Company, advantages in the colonial tea market over other merchant companies. Basically, the tax that is placed on tea is fully removed from tea if the colonies choose this company to specifically buy their tea from. So what I'm saying is that the Tea Act removed the tax that the colonists had to pay. Again, only for this one company, but that's what it did. You would think that the colonies would be happy about not having to pay a tax anymore, but because the British East India Company is now selling their tea directly to shopkeepers for that kind of cut in tax, because it doesn't exist anymore, it's cutting out the middleman who are merchants, basically people whose job is to shuttle things to and from and sell it on behalf of a buyer or on behalf of a seller. And these merchants are colonial merchants, so they're kind of being cut out of a job, but also it just angers the colonies as a whole that these laws are passed with the true and strict intention of just trying to benefit British companies. Like, they're not really doing this for the betterment of the colonies. They're just doing this to give British companies, like, their own advantage. So the colonists are very angry. Mostly the rebel colonists living in Boston. I mean, some people I'm sure are just happy not to have to pay a tax, but because the merchants are unhappy in Boston, the colonists in Boston, a few of them get very angry. The Sons of Liberty basically organize a plan to fight back. So what they do is they start not allowing any British ship from that company into the harbor. They stop allowing any British ship from that company into the harbor. They basically say, well, if they can't dock their ship, then they can't unload their goods, and it's not going to be a problem. We're going to continue to boycott you. And one ship actually makes it into the harbor. And this is in Boston. So what the Sons of Liberty do is they dress up like Mohawk Indians. Not that they're being considered Mohawk Indians, like I'm sure England knows exactly who's acting up here. But they basically disguise themselves as Mohawk Indians, they sneak onto the ship, and they pour 45 tons of tea into the Boston harbor, dumping all the cargo. Guess who's going to be a little mad about this? England. Because not only have you disobeyed their laws, you're rebelling, and now you're also wasting tea. So you could say that the Boston Tea Party is a direct response to the Tea Act, while the Coercive Acts are going to be Britain's response to the Boston Tea Party. It's basically going to be King George III's, who's the new monarch, King George III. It's going to be his way to punish Massachusetts for their misbehavior in the Boston Tea Party. So he passes what's called the Coercive Acts, but it does become known as the Intolerable Acts by the colonists. It becomes known as the Intolerable Acts. So the Coercive Acts did 4 different things. And I'm never going to make you memorize like the 4 bill titles, like Port Bill, Government Act, Quartering Act, Justice Act, but just be aware of the 4 things it does. So the first thing with the Port Bill is that the Coercive Acts closed the Boston Harbor completely. Boston Harbor is closed, which means they cannot get goods in or out, which is bad for business for Boston and Massachusetts. The second part of the Coercive Acts put the Massachusetts government in charge of the British military, put the British military, in charge of the Massachusetts government. So Massachusetts government is replaced by a military government. Thirdly, colonists have to continue providing for increased numbers of soldiers being brought into the colonies. British soldiers, they have to continue providing housing and food. And the last one is kind of different but important to note. The Justice Act, 4th part of the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts, said that any trial for crime for royal officers, any trial for a British soldier, if he's being tried for a crime that was committed in the colonies, that trial can be transferred to England, to Britain, or to other British colonies outside of Massachusetts. So imagine like a crime is committed inside of a colony, inside of Boston, by a British officer or a British soldier on a colonist. Like they want to try that person, and they want to bring that person to justice in Boston, because the court and the jury would be, peers, so it would be people in Boston. If they're being transferred to England to be tried there, they're going to be shown unfair favor. They're going to be given favor and probably won't actually be brought to justice. And so that's really going to upset the colonies. So all of these issues, especially with the Coercive Acts, are just going to lead to the need for a meeting. Okay, it's time for the colonies to meet and discuss their options, because this is getting out of hand. And this is where we have what's called the First Continental Congress. basically, the First Continental Congress was an all-colony assembly, just like the Stamp Act Congress. But they start writing another list of grievances. They ask for the taxes to be repealed. They basically directly threaten England at this point, not with rebellion, but they threaten to boycott all the British goods. But what they really want is compromise. They're not looking for a war yet. Okay, the Congress, some people are maybe leaning more that way, but as a whole, the consensus is compromise with England. Unfortunately, Britain will not compromise at this point, and they're just going to only increase the military forces in the colony. Which leads us to this last section, the Loyalists. So there are actually two groups of colonists, okay? Not everyone's a patriot. You have some colonists, citizens living in the English colonies, who are actually loyal to the British Crown. And we give these people names, the Loyalists, meaning loyal to the Crown, or they're also called Tories, T-O-R-I-E-S, like the name Tory. Tories, T-O-R-I-E-S. Now, some are, loyalists for different reasons. Some are just really afraid of the idea of rebelling against the Crown. They don't think it would ever work or be successful. Some think the Sons of Liberty are absolutely crazy. Some are, afraid of, well, what are we going to do about slavery if we break away from England? Are we going to, abolish slavery? We don't want to do that. And some are, members of the Anglican Church. And keep in mind that if you're, a true believer of the Anglican faith and you are, a clergyman, if you're, in leadership in the church, then the king is your boss. The king is the head of the church. So you can't disobey the head of your church and your faith. Some people see it as, betraying one's faith. So you kind of have this, continued struggle, not only between the colonists and the British, but within the colonies themselves, the patriots and the loyalists. And we're going to leave off with this. I know I went fast, but please listen to it again if you need to. Write down any questions you have. I do hope you all have a great Labor Day weekend, and I will see you all on Tuesday.